A megachurch that once packed thousands into its pews now has a few hundred people in the room. That's not an estimate from a rival congregation or a hostile news outlet. That's the pastor himself saying it out loud, on camera, in his own words. According to reporting from JubileeCast, Pastor Greg Locke says attendance at his church has collapsed since an FBI raid, a wave of lawsuits, and a family tragedy hit his ministry in close succession. The question this video is built around is simple. How does one of the most recognizable independent pastors in the country go from filling an arena-sized sanctuary to preaching to empty rows in what looks like the same calendar year? We're not going to pretend we know more than what's actually been reported. We're not going to invent a dollar figure, a document, or a quote that doesn't exist in the public record. What we are going to do is walk through, carefully and in order, what has actually been said, what has actually been reported, and what remains genuinely unknown. Because the honest version of this story is strange enough on its own. It doesn't need embellishment. Here's where things stand right now, in plain terms. Greg Locke built his reputation as a fire and brimstone independent pastor known for viral sermon clips and a willingness to say things other pastors wouldn't. His church grew fast, and it grew loud, the kind of ministry that draws both devoted followers and vocal critics in equal measure. Then, according to his own public statements, several things happened close together: a reported FBI raid, multiple lawsuits filed against him or his organization, and a tragedy inside his own family. In the aftermath, he says, the congregation shrank dramatically, down to what he describes as just a few hundred people on a given Sunday. One thing needs to be said clearly before we go further. As of this reporting, the full details of any federal raid, including what agents were looking for, what if anything was seized, and whether any charges have been filed against Locke or anyone connected to the church, are not confirmed in available reporting. That means we are not going to speculate about guilt. We are not going to say a crime happened. If charges exist, they are allegations, and anyone accused of anything is presumed innocent unless and until a court says otherwise. That's the accurate way to describe an unresolved situation, and we're holding that line for the entire video. So let's talk about what a raid like this typically involves in general terms, so the process makes sense even without case-specific detail. When federal agents, whether from the FBI or another agency, execute a search warrant, it means a judge has already reviewed an affidavit, a sworn document laying out probable cause, and agreed there's enough reason to believe evidence of a specific crime will be found at a specific location. A search warrant is not a charge. It's not an arrest. It's a step in an investigation. And investigations built on search warrants can end in indictments, or they can end in nothing at all, closed quietly with no public announcement. The public often hears about the raid itself, because vans and agents showing up somewhere is visible and gets noticed by neighbors and, often, by cameras. What the public frequently does not hear about, for months or ever, is how the investigation actually resolves. That gap, a loud beginning and a silent middle, is part of why situations like this generate so much speculation online. People see the raid, they don't see the outcome. And into that gap, rumor rushes in. One detail that stuck with us while looking into this: Locke didn't wait for someone else to characterize the decline. He's the one who said it. Pastors facing scandal often go quiet, let lawyers do the talking, let publicists manage the narrative. Here, according to the reporting, it's Locke's own account that attendance has fallen to a few hundred. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts against the instinct to assume every public figure in trouble hides the scale of the damage. Whether that openness is strategic, an attempt to control the story before someone else does, or simply a pastor being honest with his own congregation about hard times, isn't something we can know from the outside. But the fact that the number came from him, not a leak, not a lawsuit filing, not an anonymous source, is itself part of the story. Now, the lawsuits. Reporting indicates there are multiple lawsuits connected to Locke or his church, though the specific claims, plaintiffs, and current status of each one are not detailed in what's publicly available at this point. What we can say, generally, is how civil lawsuits against religious organizations tend to work, because the mechanics matter for understanding what multiple lawsuits actually means in practice. A lawsuit is not a criminal charge and does not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It requires a preponderance of the evidence, meaning a claim just has to be more likely true than not. Civil suits against churches and pastors have historically covered a wide range of ground. employment disputes, financial disagreements between a church and former staff or members, defamation claims, and in some past cases, more serious allegations related to how a leader conducted themselves. We are not saying which category, if any, applies here, because the reporting available to us doesn't specify. We're explaining the landscape so that multiple lawsuits doesn't sound scarier or vaguer than it needs to. It is a real legal exposure. It is not, by itself, a finding of wrongdoing. There's an obstacle baked into this whole story worth naming. A lot of what's driving public attention here is happening in the gap between what's confirmed and what's rumored. Independent megachurches, meaning churches not affiliated with a larger denomination that might otherwise provide oversight or a paper trail of official statements, often don't have a formal communications process for a crisis like this. There's no denominational spokesperson putting out a careful statement. There's often just the pastor, talking directly to his own platform, and outside reporters trying to confirm details from public records, court filings, and interviews. That gap is exactly where a story like this gets murky fast, and it's exactly where we have to be most careful not to fill silence with assumption. The stakes bend once you consider what a sustained membership collapse actually does to an independent church, because it isn't only an emotional or reputational hit. Independent megachurches typically run on tithes and offerings from a large, in-person congregation, plus whatever additional revenue comes from media platforms, book sales, or conference appearances built around the pastor's public profile. When attendance drops from thousands to a few hundred, the operating budget doesn't shrink gently. It can fall off a cliff, fast, because a huge share of giving typically comes from people physically present on a given Sunday. Staff salaries, building costs, programming, all of that scales to the crowd a church used to have, not the one it has now. So a public figure like Locke isn't just dealing with reputational damage. He's potentially dealing with an organization that has to restructure its entire financial model in real time, while the underlying legal questions are still unresolved. Here's what strikes us about this case, and it's less about Locke specifically than about the system independent megachurches operate inside more broadly. A church built primarily around one charismatic leader's personal brand is structurally fragile in a way that a denominationally governed congregation often isn't. When the leader faces a scandal, real or alleged, there's frequently no institutional buffer, no larger body absorbing the shock, spreading it out, or providing continuity while an individual case works through the legal system. The congregation's trust and the pastor's personal reputation are, in a lot of these ministries, functionally the same asset. When one takes damage, the other does too, immediately and directly. That's not a commentary on guilt or innocence in this specific situation. It's an observation about why independent ministries seem to swing so hard, so fast, between explosive growth and rapid contraction, in a way that older, more bureaucratic religious institutions typically don't. We'll say the part that'll probably get us some pushback either way. If the allegations behind these lawsuits turn out to be serious and substantiated, the fact that Locke had built such a large, devoted following on personal charisma alone made it that much harder for anyone close to him to raise concerns early, because the entire structure depended on trusting him personally rather than trusting a system with checks built in. And if, on the other hand, none of this turns out to involve real wrongdoing on his part, the same lack of institutional buffer means he's absorbing a reputational and financial hit that a denominational pastor facing an unproven allegation might not take nearly as hard. Either way, the structure itself, one person as the entire brand, cuts both ways, and it's cutting hard right now regardless of how the underlying facts eventually shake out. There's also the family tragedy mentioned in the reporting, and we want to handle that with real restraint here because the specifics of what happened are not detailed in what's publicly available, and grief is not a subject we're going to speculate about for the sake of a dramatic beat. What we can say is that a personal loss landing in the middle of a legal and reputational crisis compounds everything. It's not simply three separate bad things happening to one person in the same period. Each one makes the others harder to manage, publicly and privately. A pastor trying to hold a shrinking congregation together while also facing lawsuits and grieving a family loss is dealing with pressure from every direction at once, and how someone leads or fails to lead through that kind of convergence often becomes its own part of the public story, separate from whatever the legal outcomes eventually are. Put yourself, for a second, in the position of someone who's attended this church for years. You've watched your pastor build something from nothing into a national platform. Then, within what sounds like a short span of time, you're hearing about federal agents at the building, lawsuits with unclear details, and a tragedy in his family, all while trying to decide whether you still want your name associated with the congregation on a Sunday morning. Would you stay and wait for the facts to come out? Would you quietly stop showing up, the way it sounds like a lot of people did? There's no wrong answer, but it's worth thinking about how ordinary members experience a scandal like this from the pews, not just how it looks from the outside as a news story. So where does this actually stand right now? Locke has publicly acknowledged the drop in attendance himself, according to the reporting from JubileeCast. There is a reported FBI raid without confirmed details about its scope, target, or outcome. There are multiple lawsuits without confirmed details about their specific claims or current status. There is a family tragedy, described only in general terms in what's public. And there are, as of this reporting, no confirmed charges against Locke. That last point matters more than almost anything else in this video. A raid is not a charge. A lawsuit is not a conviction. Until and unless a court says otherwise, Greg Locke is not a convicted or formally charged individual in connection with what's been reported here, and this video is not going to imply otherwise. Is this a story about accountability finally catching up to a public figure, or a story about how quickly reputation can collapse even before any facts are actually confirmed? That's a genuinely open question, and it's one worth asking, because both possibilities are still on the table given what's actually been reported so far. What isn't yet known, and what we're not going to pretend to know, includes the specific basis for the reported FBI raid, whether it's tied to any of the pending lawsuits or to something separate entirely, the specific allegations in each of the multiple lawsuits and where they currently stand procedurally, and whether any federal charges will ultimately be filed against Locke or anyone else connected to the church. Those are the real open questions here. And if you want to follow this as it develops, the most reliable path is checking primary sources directly rather than relying on secondhand summaries, including this one. We cut a few of the more granular details about the lawsuits from this video simply because they aren't confirmed enough yet to state as fact, not because they wouldn't make for a juicier story. If more specifics become public and verified, that's a follow-up worth doing. For now, the honest version of this story is the one where a lot remains unresolved, and we'd rather leave it that way than manufacture a tidy ending the facts don't support yet.